there we go. So last time we started looking at really the first movement of the 20th century that's considered modernism. And that was Fauvism and Expressionism, which, as we saw, were very similar in some ways. The biggest difference is the fact that one group was French and one group was German. And so even if their intentions are the same, they're going to do it very differently because there are traditions. In fact, it's a kind of an extreme. If German art is the most emotional and passionate and expressive in the Western world, French art is just the opposite. It is the most dispassionate, the most classical, the most intellectual. And so we were sort of looking at two extremes there. If you took the Western art course I did in 2020, or if you I'm going to plan to do that in the fall again for all the people that missed that, because a lot of people missed that. We'll do that survey. And as we look at over broad periods of time, these sort of traditions become more obvious. When you look at the whole history of Western art, the sense of what makes art German, or the sense of what is Italian or what is French or what is British, starts becoming more and more obvious. And it carries over right into today. So those two movements, Fauvism ends fairly early by 1907, 1908, because it's replaced by Cubism in Paris as a dominant sort of avant-garde. Expressionism in Germany will continue right up to World War I. Everything changes after World War I, as we'll see. That's a whole redefining of everything, literally, at that point. So we're still dealing with this period. So Cubism comes along, and it has a slow start. There's some early years, and we'll look at some early work and see what we mean by Cubism. It has multiple phases. It's much more complex than you might think. It's a product of two people. And I think it's highly doubtful that either one of them alone would have ever developed what we think of today as Cubism. It's really a mix of two things. Picasso, as we will see, comes along and brings in the form early on, but as a Spaniard, he does not have the sort of dispassionate relationship to what he does that the Frenchman Braque has. So he brings the Frenchness into it and takes it out of the expressive realm that it was with Picasso. Spanish art is going to be quite emotional and passionate in general, not as much as German art, but a lot more than French. So as we'll see, his early work is more personal, it's more emotional, and in many ways is closer to German Expressionism than French Fauvism. So Braque comes along and they start working together, and this is a collaboration. Sometimes artists working in different places will come up with similar ideas. That's not what's happening here. These two are working together very closely, and it's a true collaboration. In fact, there is a period from around 1909-10 where they swore after the fact they couldn't remember who did which work. I mean, if the works weren't signed, they couldn't remember. I mean, that's how closely they were working. Scholars, I know some scholars who are experts in these two, and they say they can always recognize the difference. Sometimes I think I can do it too, but not 100% of the time. So I don't know whether they're telling the truth, that they couldn't tell the difference or not. But anyway, that's what they said. So we'll start with Picasso's early work, and then we'll sort of go back and forth and watch it develop. And then we'll look at some of the offshoots or some of the things that come out of Cubism. Picasso was absolutely a prodigy. I mean, he's the essence of a prodigy. I've got some of his work when he was 14. I'll show you in a minute. But it's clear from early on, he was an exceptional artist. His father was an art teacher. I mean, he grew up, that always gives you a head start in what you are doing. He was from Malaga, Spain, but went fairly early to study in Barcelona, and we'll talk about that. His first trip to Paris is in 1900. When he was 19, and so he's really going to spend most of his career in Paris. We think of him that way, but it is important to always remember he's not French. Just because he's living in Paris doesn't mean he's French. He doesn't have a French sensibility, and that's going to affect his art. He does a lot of self-portraits. I think a lot of people are familiar with his self-portraits. Here's a couple of early works. So he's 14 here. So then at 16, he goes to Barcelona to study. Now, these to me don't look like the works of a 14-year-old. There's clearly a sort of classical foundation, undoubtedly, probably from his father, who's an art teacher. So he got early training to give him that classical foundation. Fairly quickly in Paris. He's actually a fairly successful artist. From early on, he was successful, more so than some of the post-impressionists were of the previous generation. When he goes to Paris, 1900 and shortly after, he's of course going to be influenced by whatever the dominant voice was. And at that time, it was still the symbolist movement. And just as we saw Matisse last time was very influenced by the symbolist, absolutely Picasso is. He took to it very naturally, being sort of an expressive person. I love this self-portrait. It's really very much symbolist, and reminding you of what symbolist art was. It was in one of the dominant art forms of the 1880s and 90s, and it was a group, large groups of artists who believed that art should not be just realistically looking at the world, but it should come from the imagination. They were looking primarily at poetry, because the symbolist movement began in poetry, and then it moved into the visual arts. And so they were looking for qualities or characteristics of poetry. And I think you can see that here. It's sort of moody and sort of suggestive. They liked suggesting moods without giving you anything specific or detailed. Just be suggestive. Let your imagination try and understand what's going on. If they felt that the realists were too specific, realists are going to tell you a story. Here's what happened. This happened to this person at this day. They felt that wasn't very interesting. If I just create a mood, then your mind can imagine what might have happened and when and how. That's what poems do, right? Poetry is different from a novel. A novel tells you this, this, this. Poems give you evocative words and phrases, and they allow your mind to create. So that's what they're trying to do. Now, a good parallel, I love these self-portraits, but here's a self-portrait by Edvard Munch, who's one of the foremost symbolists. We looked at his, the Scream, influencing German expressionist art, but these are both very symbolist. Munch was a symbolist, Picasso's influenced by symbolists, but they're very similar, the uplit, and there's something very romantic about both of them. So early Picasso, symbolist inspiration, and that's what triggered what's known as his blue period. The blue period is a short-lived period. He's in Paris, he's influenced by the symbolists, and it's called the blue period for a couple of reasons. Largely, one reason is the color blue dominates, but also blue in the sense of moody or melancholy, that sort of analogy. This is also very symbolist influence in the what he's attempting to talk about, la vie or life, and it's meant to be I don't know, how do you in one image communicate the essence of life? So he gives us multiple generations. It's about the experience of life from baby to the next phase in your life as a young couple, to the next phase as an older woman. I mean, a lot of artists have attempted to do this. Gauguin has a famous painting where he shows people of all different ages, and it's really about the passage of life and the essence of life. Now, as a subject, that's pretty grand. If I'm going to have a subject matter, the meaning of life is about as big as you're going to find in terms of subject matter. The symbolists like to do that. They like to address these big, overarching, sort of universal concepts, like how do I express the idea of, jealousy and anger and hatred. And these are sort of abstract concepts. This is the difference between the way a realist would approach it and a symbolist. Let's say I wanted to express the idea of jealousy. Well, a realist might either write a story, if you're a writer, or paint a painting that shows an example of jealousy. Here's one person doing something and here's the other person being jealous. They're very specific narrative storytelling through an example of that, where a symbolist doesn't want to give you one example. That's limiting. They want just the broad idea. So in this case, the broad idea of life as a sort of metaphor of life. And that's what we see in the blue period. The influence we see of the symbolists is also in these little figures. If you notice the forms, it's not just the subject matter that's symbolist, so are the forms. The symbolists of the 1880s and 90s, and these are examples, 3 different examples. This is a Rodin sculpture, a Munch print, and a Camille Claudel sculpture. And they all have a similar sort of form where you have, first of all, they're very fluid forms. They sort of melt into one another, and one is sort of curling in or subsuming another. That was a very popular symbolist sort of visual symbol that they often used for a sort of tormented soul. They used it for a lot of different things. In the symbolist world, everything is negative. I mean, love is always like the worst possible outcome. I mean, whatever is happening in the symbolist world, it's always the darkest view of it. They're really picking up from the romantics in a way, but they're even more, they have more angst than the romantics do from earlier in the century. But, he's looked at a lot. You see similar sorts of forms with one curving around another and curving in on itself, and how that creates a mood. I mean, clearly that's a very different mood than somebody standing upright with their arms reaching out. It's just a different mood, and it comes from the shape of the forms themselves. So we see that in this little work as well. Even the Guitarist, which is a very well-known, famous piece by him, I like to compare it to Rodin. That's a mistake. That's not a Munch. I don't know why it says compare Munch old woman. That's a Rodin old woman. I must have been copying and pasting one too many times. That's the problem with copying and pasting. You make mistakes like that, which you didn't if you typed it out yourself. That's clearly not a Munch. He's a painter. That's a Rodin. And Rodin was probably the master symbolist sculptor. All of his works have this quality to them, and he's borrowing that here. Now, things begin to change 1905, 1906, and he begins to be influenced by interesting things that are coming into Paris and being shown, particularly different kinds of so-called primitive art. And talked about that last time. Primitive meaning anything that's not Western art was called primitive. Europeans had an ambivalent relationship to non-Western cultures. Clearly, they saw themselves as superior to everyone else, Western culture superior to all other non-Western cultures. But at the same time, they had an admiration for aspects of it. They saw things in it that they admired while at the same time feeling superior to it. It somehow could work that out. And this fascination with all of this sort of African sculpture and sculpture from the Oceanics, from the South Pacific. And they even considered Japanese art, which had been flooding Europe for 50, 60 years by that time. They even considered that primitive, which is a real joke because Japanese art's far more sophisticated than Western art, as we saw in the 19th century. But nonetheless, he's beginning to be fascinated with that. In fact, he was a major collector of African sculpture. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This is his portrait of Gertrude Stein. This is sort of that period where, she's an expatriate American, and Gertrude Stein in Paris was sort of the center of her salons. She was the center of everything that was happening in Paris at the time. Everybody knew Gertrude Stein. She was sort of an early collector of his work as well, a great supporter of all the avant-garde artists. This portrait of her is interesting because it's actually two different portraits painted at two different times. The body, everything but the face, was painted in 1905. I think it's likely I mean, I haven't seen an X-ray of this, but I suspect he probably did have a different face on it in 1905. And then in 1906, after seeing a certain exhibition, he goes back and repaints the face. And if you look, they really are two different styles. Look at the hands, which are far more naturalistic, and then the face is greatly simplified and distorted. It's really quite different. And that's because of certain things that he saw. He spent the summer of 1906 in a small Spanish village, and he was under the influence that summer of Iberian sculpture. While he was in this small village, he saw a number of pieces of Iberian sculpture, and Iberia is simply the name of the peninsula where Spain and Portugal are. So Iberian simply means ancient Spanish art. So this is sort of an archaic style that goes back to ancient Spain. And this is an example of it. And you can clearly see how he's mimicking those forms. It's a simplification of the face. It's a reduction of the features of the human face to very, very simple forms and very exaggerated and what they would have called primitive. I would just call, very simple. And this is a self-portrait he did in 1906. And it's right after that he goes back to Paris now and decides to repaint the face on Gertrude Stein. So that's where that face is coming from. It's modeling that simplified facial features that we saw in the Iberian sculpture. Another important influence during this period, particularly particularly 1907 and after, is Paul Cézanne. And I want to talk about Cézanne. He is another one of the post-impressionist artists who dominated the 80s and the 90s. Last time we looked at the Fauves and the German expressionists, they were largely influenced by Gauguin, and then the Germans by Van Gogh. Those are two of the post-impressionists, not so much Cézanne. Cézanne's interest in geometry and structure was not of interest to them. Cézanne's influence is going to be felt beginning in 1906 and especially in 1907, largely because he died in 1906. There is a major retrospective early in 1907, and his letters and diaries were published in 1907. That's going to trigger interest. I mean, just like it does today. If there's a major retrospective of someone, it's going to affect things, and people tend to get major retrospectives when they die. That's just what you did then. Not so much today. Artists today can get retrospectives before they die if they're just really successful, but typically you look at when somebody dies, and that's when influence is going to sort of rise, at least for a little bit, of their work. What Cézanne was interested in, he was actually quite ahead of his time in, say, the 1880s when he was doing a lot of this. He was one of the first people to be really interested in the sort of integrity of the two-dimensional picture plane, the idea of the flatness of the surface. Increasingly, artists in the 20th century are going to reflect on this idea that for a very long time, for like 500-600 years, artists had been pretending that canvases weren't flat, right? Go back to the Renaissance, the key idea of Renaissance painting is that you were supposed to pretend like this was a window you're looking through. You're not supposed to think of this as a flat surface. You were supposed to think of the picture plane, which is this imaginary plane, as if it were a glass window. And therefore, they meticulously constructed this believable space behind the picture plane so that you could forget that this is flat. Well, that's not actually true. It is flat. It's not a window. It's not sculpture. And increasingly from the late 19th and into the early 20th century, artists are really interested in this idea that, why are we lying? Why are we pretending we're sculpture when we're not? You want three-dimensional art, go make a sculpture. This is a painting. So how can I be true to the reality of this painting rather than, it was seen as dishonest, in other words, pretending it wasn't what it was. And so Cézanne began to experiment with sort of mark making, color. He's creating what is sometimes an uncomfortable space. I love this. It's one of my favorite Cézannes, and he's one of my favorite artists. And we have some beautiful Cézanne in the Nelson. But the way he's using color and mark making belies the subject that you see. Now, we know how to read this. I mean, we know we're supposed to read this as land. The title tells you that this is a riverbank, so these must be reflections in water, right? And this is the riverbank. We know that those trees are meant to be behind, and then we know the sky is even farther away. So intellectually, we know how we're supposed to read this. But he's violating the rules of perspective that a Renaissance artist would have used to enhance that illusion. Normally, things closer to you are going to be brighter colors, they're going to be bigger, they're going to be sharper. And as things go back in space, they get smaller, the colors get lighter and begin to become hazy and become more gray. And if you follow those rules of perspective, they will parallel what your mind is telling you. Well, he's not doing that. He's got very bright colors far in the distance. He's using the same size marks for something that's very close to you as you're using for something that's far away, and even the brightness of the sky. So when you look at this in your mind, it sort of lays back in space, and then suddenly it pops up and it looks very flat. And then it goes back in space. It's a conflict. There's a conflict intentionally going on here between 2D and 3D. And he's doing that on purpose. And it creates this wonderful, I think, an energy in the scene. It makes it far more interesting than if it were just another boring landscape where everything, is the way you expect to read it. So that's what he's doing. So 20th century artists are going to pick up on that for a number of reasons in a number of different ways. And Picasso's one of the first, or Braque actually is one of the first, as we'll see in a minute. So other influence in 1906 and 7, Cézanne's retrospective in late 06, Cézanne's letters, where he talks about these ideas in 1907, and then there's a very large African art exhibition in 1907. We're going to put all those together. Here's a self-portrait from 1907. Yes.
What medium is he using?
Oil paint. All of his paintings are oil paint. Now, Cézanne used watercolors sometimes, but Picasso's oil. And of course he does sculpture as well, and we'll look at some of his sculpture. If it's painting, unless I tell you otherwise, it's oil. That's all people are using at this point. There is going to be a brief experimentation with acrylic in the 1960s, but that has more to do with advertising and popular culture than with art, and that ends fairly quickly, and now most people work with oil again. So in terms of African sculpture, this was a huge exhibition in Paris, and of course people had already seen it, but this was a big one, and it does influence everyone. And to take all of the styles of sculpture from this massive continent and reduce it to one label, African sculpture, is really not appropriate or fair, but that's what we're doing here. There is no one thing that's African sculpture. African art varies from realism to abstraction to every other possible thing. But frankly, nobody in the early 20th century really cared that much. They weren't ethnographers. Don't confuse people who are borrowing all of these styles from African art as people who know anything about African art or care anything about African art. They don't. They're looting it. They're just sort of looting these forms. All they feel when they look at African art is it looks aggressive to them. It looks aggressive, and that's what they're tapping into. Here's an image of Picasso, and you can see African sculptures behind him, and he was a collector himself. He owned a few. That tells you they didn't cost very much at that time. When we see a self-portrait like this, To many artists, discontinuities reflected the disharmonies of modern culture. This commenting on modern culture, I'm going to talk more about, because that's going to be everything, certainly after World War I, but even before. But they mostly saw it as aggressive and confrontational. That's what they saw, even though that's not what it meant. I mean, this Bakota figure you see here on the right, that is a guardian figure. It was sort of guarding the ashes of an ancestor. It's a protective form. It is meant to be look a little bit fierce because it's protecting from evil spirits or whatever, but it's not an evil image. It's actually a protective form. And there are other sculptures that symbolize, beauty, but, Westerners didn't know how to see it. They didn't know how to read it. So it just looked aggressive. But I find the difference between the self-portrait on the left and on the right to be really telling how quickly things are changing and how quickly influences are changing. But he's come a long way from 06 to 07. And 07, of course, it marks the year, actually began it in late 06. And then again, repainted part of it after he saw that African exhibition. His most famous piece, probably the most famous painting of all 20th century modern art, is his very, very famous Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the large 8 foot by 8 foot. It's in the Museum of Modern Art. And it really is sort of a very early, ultimate expression of early modernism. It's not really Cubism. I refer to it as proto-Cubism. It's usually referred to as sort of the foundation of Cubism. What that means is Cubism is going to come out of it, but it's not yet Cubism. And there's one really, really good reason why this isn't Cubism. It's Cubist in form, but it's not Cubist in subject. Real Cubism we'll see in just a minute. So let's talk about what we've got here. Anybody familiar with this painting or seen it or where? Yeah, I mean, if you know anything about 20th century art, you've probably run across this painting somewhere. The women of Avignon, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, but it's not Avignon, France. That's not the Avignon. This is the Avignon district, which is a district in Barcelona where Picasso had really lived much of his life, and it was the red light district. These are prostitutes on the streets of Barcelona, and they are meant to be terrifying. This is meant to be a frightening, aggressive, in-your-face, scary thing. And it's also very symbolist influenced. This, to me, is a 20th century equivalent of all of those 19th century femme fatales that we saw when we looked at 19th century art. All those dangerous women, all those images of Salome, all those aggressive images of women who were going to bring about the downfall of man. The idea of sexually aggressive women being the destructive force in society is a theme that runs through modernism. It reared its head in the late 19th century as women were becoming more independent in all these various Eves and Salome's and Pandora's, and even Judith got brought in. And Judith is definitely not a femme fatale from biblical Judith heroine, but nonetheless in art she got lumped in with all these other destructive women. This is a 20th century version of it. He's not veiling it in some illusion of mythology, etc., as they did in the 19th century. But these are scary women. This is coming from the psyche of a young man who probably in his youth saw these women on the street and was terrified by how aggressive they were. We already saw one painting last week, Kirchner's Street in Berlin, where he had these women who were prostitutes sort of accosting these men. And apparently this was fairly common practice, but Picasso's taking it sort of over the top and giving us something like really quite aggressive. You see it with this middle figure with her arms up as if she's trying to be alluring, but she's really just terrifying. Now, what he went back and repainted in 1907 were these two faces on the right, which are clearly directly taken from African masks. Again, just just meant to look aggressive. In terms of the space, he's breaking that down into planes. He's beginning to think of the flat space and the planes. We'll get there and talk more about that in just a minute. But here's some of the sort of masks that he's looked at and that he's borrowing for his aggressive forms. You know, this one reminds me very much of this Pagoda figure, but other types of masks appear, where these figures over here, particularly these two, are more like that Iberian sculpture. So these are more the late 1906 style. These are the 1907. So in one painting, he's combining both that 06 and 07 style. Their art dealer, who wrote a small book, Daniel Kahnweiler, who wrote a small book on Cubism in 1915, which is really early, said he felt this painting was not really successful. He felt that it was not successful, and what he meant by that was Picasso was trying to do too much. He was trying to examine the nature of form and shape while he still had color in it, while he was dealing with subject matter, and he's not wrong. He is really dealing with a lot of different variables here. And so real Cubism, which is about to begin, is going to pull back on that and not deal with as many things. This is clearly a personal and very emotional piece. This is really closer to German Expressionism than it is to real Cubism. It has that personal, emotional content that real Cubism will not have.
Peggy, could you give the name of that author again?
Daniel Kahnweiler. It's Kahnweiler, and he wrote Der Weg des Kubism. It's in German. I'm sure it's been translated, The Rise of Cubism. And he wrote it in 1915, which is incredibly early to have the kind of insight that he really has. We usually need a lot more time. But anyway, that was a really good book. What we're also seeing here is someone who's initiating a conversation. 1:35 p.m. I don't know where that came from. Anyway, he's also dealing with a tradition that's been around in art really since the Renaissance, of this idea of power. Conversations in power and sexuality used as part of conversations in power, usually female sexuality conversations in power, because art was, let's face it, mostly made by men. So they're dealing with their own issues. Going back to Titian's Venus of Urbino, Manet, who was intentionally commenting on the Titian and updating that to a sort of 19th century modernism, and now Picasso, who is very likely intentionally commenting on the Manet in now a 20th century context. And I think the most interesting part of all of that is not the specific works, but the way art is now creating this conversation with previous art to talk about art, to talk about the nature of art. And that's only going to increase as we get more and more into the 20th century. It's artists talking to other artists. It's a very different context in which art plays a role today as in this sort of dialogue. It's also an interesting sort of play on Matisse's The Dance. I mean, these two, Matisse's is actually later. The date isn't that important. I just find them interesting. I don't mean they relate to one another intentionally, but they're two different kinds of voices at the same moment in time. Matisse's voice is really quite different from Picasso's. Matisse is French. His art's never going to have the emotional impact of a Picasso. It's just not. This is one of my favorite essay questions on exams. If you were going to get an exam from me, I might throw this up on the screen and ask you to write me an essay on these two. How are they similar? How are they different? Why were the intents different? The intentions of the artist different? Are their backgrounds? You could write a book literally on these two and how they relate to one another and what that tells us about this moment in time. So I just find this very interesting. 5 nude women. That's that's where you're starting. But very different takes on what that means. One's really personal and one's really not, but there's more to it even than that. Okay, so breaking up structure. I want to talk about the structure a little more later. Cézanne's structural aesthetic, we see that here in the Chateau Noir, particularly you see it in his landscapes, where he's sort of breaking things up into these planes, these sort of smaller geometric marks. It's very likely Picasso. See, look at that, 1906, just before he died, 1907. Cézanne is still alive and working, and almost at the same time is painting his nudes. So it's not like there's 20 years apart. It's not like Cézanne is way back in the 19th century. He was, but he's still around and still working in 1906. So they really are overlapping in time. Study of planes rather than masses. This is one of the major differences in 20th century modernism and historical or more traditional art. You know, especially when we look at the sculpture, this will be true. But even in painting, this is really not about mass. He's not trying to create the illusion of really solid, massive three-dimensional forms. It's not about mass. It's about planes. Now, that's going to really play a role in sculpture because it's going to redefine sculpture entirely. But this is definitely already there. It's not about masses, because masses are about illusions. Right? If I wanted to show a figure with three-dimensional solid mass, I would be creating the illusion of a three-dimensional form. But they're already rejecting that idea because that's a lie, right? It's a flat surface. It's not a three-dimensional form. So the loss of mass is one step in that direction of rejecting three-dimensional lies, because that's what it was. I mean, they lied to us in the Renaissance. Yes.
Picasso seems to be receptive between the right and left side of the picture. Does it have anything to do that where he was in Spain, they were near to Portugal, that had been interacting with those large African kingdoms for 500 years?
No, not by this time. Africa, everybody's in Africa. I mean, the 1880s, they literally divided up Africa.
Late in the century, they started the colonial.
No, that was earlier. The Portuguese were the first, but that was way before. This is much later, and they're all there by now. And the stuff is all coming in. Europe's filled with, has looted most of the world by this time. But that was a good thought. You're right. Portugal is the first. So let's talk about Braque and see what he's bringing to the mix. Georges Braque, the Frenchman. Braque is a really interesting person who doesn't get the credit. Picasso gets all the credit because he's not as loud. I mean, he's a nice, quiet Frenchman. Picasso's the big, loud Spaniard. He gets all the attention. But Braque, his contribution is extremely important, and I love his late work. He started out early, before he met Picasso, doing a sort of Fauve-like. I mean, his early work is basically influenced by the Fauves. There's really not much more to say about it than that. But he meets Picasso in 1907. They have the same art dealer, Daniel Kahnweiler, who brought Braque to Picasso's studio, and he saw Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. He's one of the few people who did. Demoiselles d'Avignon was not exhibited publicly until the 1930s. People didn't know that painting unless, a few people in the art world who went to Picasso's studio saw it, and Braque was one of the early ones, and he immediately went, "Oh, wow, this is no more Fauve. Let's get into this. Let's talk about this." So this is one of his sort of independent experiments with looking at breaking the form in this way, and working with, planes and sort of, again, primitive, simplified form. He's influenced also by African art, but not the aggressive kind, not the sort of expressive and emotional and intense kind as Picasso was. It's a very different sort of influence. But for Braque, the number one influence is Cézanne. I mean, Braque is French, Cézanne is French. He gravitates to Cézanne in a way that Picasso never will. I mean, Cézanne is coming in through Braque. They have the same sensibility. It's a sort of intellectualizing about art and form. This is a Braque viaduct at L'Estaque. In fact, L'Estaque, it's a small town where he went to paint, is where Cézanne painted. He goes to L'Estaque because Cézanne has all these paintings of L'Estaque. So he wants to, go to the same place, look at the same things. And this could almost pass as a late Cézanne. Actually, it could pass as a small detail in a Cézanne. Absolutely, it could. In fact, here is a Cézanne from 98. He's using the colors, and Cézanne used very unusual sorts of greens. It's very unusual green. Even the yellows and oranges are green. But the way he's taking the mass and bringing it into planes, flat planes. That's what Cézanne is doing in the 1890s, even in the 80s. That's what Braque is doing. It's a short step from Cézanne of the 19th century to the Cubists of the 20th. It's not a big leap. It's a short step. Now, they're working together by this time, or they're getting to know each other. And the most important part of this painting by Picasso is how impersonal it is now, how unemotional it is. That's what Braque is bringing to the mix. Stop being so emotional, get rid of all this angst and start examining form. Let's start being scientific about this. We want to understand how we read forms on a flat surface. How do we do that? I'm going to throw one more thing in the mix. French philosopher Henri Bergson, Bergson. Bergson is lecturing at the Sorbonne in Paris in the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, Matisse went to hear some of his lectures. We know artists talked about all these things, and others went to his lectures. Bergson talked about a great many things. And one of the things he talked about was this idea of reality. What is reality? How do we perceive reality? It's not so much what is reality as how do we perceive reality? What is happening that makes us perceive reality? And from the Renaissance on, it was just sort of taken for granted that we look at the world and we take it all in, and that's how we know what's real. In fact, you see that in the Renaissance painting, for example. A Renaissance painting has a fixed viewpoint, a fixed point of view for the viewer, a vanishing point. Everything is placed in relation to that. Everything is in clear, sharp detail. That's how I see the world. Well, Bergson is saying, no, that's not really how we construct our sense of reality. In the modern world, we experience the world differently. We're moving through the world and things are changing rapidly. And he says reality actually comes from an accumulation of experiences. So if I would get up and walk across the room while I'm talking, and I would sort of see you from here and then see you from there and see you from there and you from over there, I would put together all these different points of views and images, and together they form my reality of what this room looks like. So it's not a fixed, permanent point of view, but an accumulation over time of experiences. And that's a very different way of thinking about reality. And that intrigued a lot of people. It intrigued a lot of artists. Well, if that's true, then as a painter, how do I suggest that? How do I suggest, I don't want to paint like the Renaissance painter did, because that's not how we see the world in the modern era. I can't just give you one fixed image from one point of view. How do I construct this idea of multiple points of view that all come together? Voila. It's called Cubism. That's exactly what's happening here. Take a look at the details. You're seeing buildings from multiple points of view. Look at this building up here. You're seeing this side from the front, this roof from this side, this roof from this side, and then you've moved way over to the right to see this side. So it's taking the building and seeing multiple points of view all at the same time.
Where's the reservoir?
I'm thinking maybe, I'm not sure, maybe this, is this meant to be perhaps a reflection? Don't get too literal on me. This is the early 20th century. But maybe that's,
You call it a city, I get it. But
yeah, no, I think maybe that. But again, experiment. Let me try this and see, does this have is this a modern language? Does this look like because they're still searching for that visual language. They're still looking for a visual language to express the modern age. They were doing it in the 19th century. They're still looking, but they're at a different point in time now. It's a different world. So now we need a 20th century language. So let's try this. No, that didn't work. Okay, let's try this. That's where the art's coming from. Cézanne. Interesting, Cézanne was playing with a lot of these same things. In some of the, if you could isolate some of these details, they would very much look like a Cubist works, but it's very similar. He does open up buildings and looks at multiple points of view in some of his works. Braque's Viaduct, Picasso's Reservoir, doing the same thing. Both of these works, it wasn't that work because that wasn't until 2009, but they first showed together, I think it was the Independence, which was the spring of 2008, and that's when a critic in a review used the word, I think it was Louis Vaucel, the critic, who wrote that it was a derogatory term. He says it just looks like a bunch of little cubes, and then he referred to it as cubism, as a sort of throwaway. But other people have later said he at that exhibition he overheard Matisse refer to him as a bunch of little cubes. So it could have come from Matisse, actually, who used the term, and Vaucel overheard him and wrote it out. Wherever it came from, it was a derogatory term, but it just stuck. It's where we get the name. Now, I want to move into really the phases of Cubism. Now we're in fully developed Cubism. Now we really begin the serious experiment. Now's when we get together, lock ourselves in a studio, let's start experimenting. And I think you really have to think of this as like a scientific experiment. We're going to try things. And the first phase is called analytic cubism. It lasts for 2 years maximum. When I say experiment, they were very much like scientists. When you're doing a scientific experiment, first thing you want to do is minimize the variables, minimize the things that you're going to change from one experiment to the next. So the first thing you're going to do is eliminate color. There's largely no color. They do it for 2 reasons. Get rid of a variable that can be affecting the work of art. We know that color can have a huge impact on how you read space, how you read three-dimensional form. It's also the most emotional of all elements of form. Color is very emotional. So let's get rid of it, and then we eliminate emotion, we eliminate a variable. So we'll see that they largely eliminate color. Now we just have to work with plane and how planes relate on a surface. Now, what is interesting about analytic cubism, and this is an early one, cubism is never non-objective. It's abstract, it's distorted, but you're always supposed to be able to read something and see what it is. It's just a distorted version of that, but it's never non-objective. It gets close, but you should read something. And this is clearly a person, portrait of Ambroise Vollard, who was another art dealer in Paris. What they're experimenting with here is the idea of structure. How you create, structure and form. And I like the analogy of scaffolding, because when I see like big scaffolding everywhere, they're working on a building, you've got all these verticals and all these horizontals, and they become a structure. And it's like a kind of grid in a way, but not a perfect grid. But there's a sort of scaffolding, a geometric scaffolding, and then sort of hanging from that at different depths are these planes that will define the form. There is depth Cubism is not flat. If you haven't tried it, it's almost impossible to actually paint a flat picture because the human mind will read foreground, background, and create space. So these have a space, but it's a shallow space, a very shallow space. There's a scaffolding and then planes hang before and after. So let's break it apart. And what they do in analytic cubism is they'll start with a form like a person, or as we'll see, like guitars, whatever, and then sort of fracture it. You know, it's like fractured glass too. It almost reminds me of that. That's what Cézanne often used, that sort of fracturing analysis in his works. So an early work, here's one, another one, here's Braque. This is the period where they can't remember who's doing what. They're working so closely together. Now here you can see that space a little bit better in the Braque. Again, we've got violin and palette. There's more of a readable space here. It's more depth. I can read a foreground, background. This is in front and that's behind. Therefore, there's space in there. I can't help but, I know it's titled Violin and Palette, and I know that this is the palette up here, but because of the proportions of the format itself, I cannot help but read this as a person standing there, and that this as a kind of head. I just do. Whether that's intentional or that's just me reading it that way, you know, we do tend to read certain proportions. If something is roughly the proportions of a human being, we will read it in relation to that. We can't help that. We're human beings. We read the world in relation to us. Everything is in relation to our size, our shape, our scale. That's how we interact with the world. Analytic cubism was an interesting experiment. Yeah.
You said that the human mind puts things into the picture, you can't help it. Do different critics, when they view, like you say, you saw a person, would different critics looking at over time see different things in the same painting?
Absolutely. Any work that's ever been made, its meaning changes over time. I mean, it's true of Renaissance, Middle Ages, 19th century, or anything made today. People of different periods are going to interpret it entirely differently.
The three nudes, it would be interesting to go into an analysis of how Picasso viewed those nudes, those earlier nudes, as to how we might today, as to who has the power.
It's especially today, everything is real. I mean, we live in a world where we are hyper conscious of issues of power and sexuality. I mean, our world is going to see everything differently from any point in time because of our relationship to those ideas. So, yeah.
The one on the left, when I first saw it, I thought of the Matrix or 2001.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like fracturing reality. It's very like, you know, the effects. They couldn't do it any other way but paint it at that time. But yeah, these are special effects. So, you know, it's like you're fracturing the piece. Just, you know, this is sort of late at its end. This is as close as Cubism will get to being non-objective. One on the left is pretty darn hard to see a person or a thing in it. It communicates the idea of a person, again, in its format, the fact that it's tall and vertical, these lines that create the shape. There's just the vaguest suggestion there's of this person. The one on the right, you can see a person more clearly. I can see sort of like a profile and arms or shoulders, but this is as far as it gets. We begin to see, and this Braque was the first to do this, lettering begins to appear. There are different interpretations as to why that is. Some people think it's purely formal. In other words, letters identify a surface. They lock in a surface. They lock in a picture plane, and then other things, other planes are either in front of it or behind it. So it helps you identify the space. Other people have interpreted and said, no, you should read the words. They mean things, and they're sort of social content. But I don't think that's ever been I don't think there's any sort of agreement yet on what that means. But analytic cubism is interesting, but it was a dead end. It's not so much a dead end as a cul-de-sac. It's like you have to go down this street, but okay, that doesn't work, so let's come back out again. And they move to what? There's an extra K on there. It's not synthetic cubismic, it's cubism. Synthetic cubism, the second phase, is the one that really has the impact, and they begin thinking entirely differently. It's an actual reversal of how you think. If analytic cubism, if analysis is taking a form and breaking it down, synthesis is where you start with many different things and you merge them together into a single whole. So it's like a reversal of how you think about form. Instead of taking one thing and breaking it apart, you take many things and bring them together. And that's synthetic cubism, or synthesis, merging into a whole. Now, there was an art form that was a catalyst for this way of thinking, and that is the collage, because that's what a collage is. A collage, by definition, is where you start with different things and you layer them and you bring them together. It's a collage mentality that led to synthetic cubism. In fact, this is an actual collage. I mean, there are literally things attached to the surface. That's what a collage is. It's a two-dimensional work of art that has extraneous materials attached to the surface. And in this case, this sort of chair caning is actually a pre-printed paper that's been glued onto the canvas. I mean, that's not drawn, that's printed paper. And also that's a real rope that's put around the outside. Now that's Picasso. Picasso, I can pick him out from Baroque sometimes because there's an element of humor in his work. There's an element of, I don't know, whimsy, using that rope, which mimics carved wood, those beautiful carved picture frames. Well, the rope has a design that's sort of similar to that. And I think it's a play on wooden carved picture frames that he glued around it. This is not the first collage, nor is it the first synthetic cubist. I'm just showing it to you because it's a really important one. Collage isn't new. Collage has been part of sort of folk art traditions for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's new to fine art. It's the first time collage has been brought into something that would be considered fine art, and that will continue. The image itself, this is not big, 10 by 13 inches. It's very playful, and I show you images of these Parisian, street cafes often have these round glass top tables. The chairs were often chair caning. So it's a sort of play on, or a sort of pastiche, or bringing together bits and pieces of what might be on the table. Is he suggesting, we're looking through the glass and we see the chair caning, through the glass as you see the chair. You have things like bottles, jours, like there's a newspaper laying on the table. It's fair, and then there's sort of paint over the top of it. It is a sort of a montage of things you might see on that table, bringing them together to create this whole. The other thing that plays on it is, the tables are generally round, but he's showing us this oval because when you see them at an angle like this, you see the oval. So, is he doing that on purpose? Is that part of it? Which makes it all very playful. Now, this is one of the earliest works using found objects, and we're going to see a lot more use of found objects, and we'll talk about found objects. A found object is anything that is used in a work of art, whether it's 2D, 3D, whatever, that originally had some other function. Now, that rope, for example, was a rope before he chose it and put it around there. I mean, he didn't make that rope. It existed before. It has its own existence before an artist finds it. And it's the same is true with that paper. That would have when it was made, it wasn't made so Picasso could put it in this painting. It was made to be functional for some other thing, and he chose it. We call those found objects. It doesn't mean you have to literally find it. It simply means it had some other function. And as we'll see later, today even, but definitely later in other classes, found objects can be really powerful because we know what they are and they have associations in our minds and we can never forget them. I mean, you know what a rope is, you know what a rope is for. You're never going to not know that. So if an artist knows how to choose objects, they can bring in meaning just by choosing this other form that may be a powerful object that for the viewer has associations. So using found objects can be really powerful in art, and we'll see some cases of that. Here's another one, a collage, layering real newspaper, that bits of real newspaper there. That's a Brock. The Brock's less humorous, less emotional, i.e. more French in his work than Picasso. But synthetic cubist painting doesn't have to actually be a collage. It just borrows the aesthetics of a collage. Most cubist paintings are real paintings. They're not all actual collages. This is nothing but a painting, but it has the aesthetics of a collage, right? It's painted in such a way that it appears as if there are things layered. But it's very much that synthetic sensibility where you take a thing from here and a thing from here and you layer them and bring them together. The other thing is, obviously, they've brought color back into the mix. The color is now part of the work. This is one reason why synthetic cubism has a much longer lifespan and is much more influential, because it actually is more successful. Analytic cubism was a kind of a dead end. They reduced themselves down to nothing, and that was really not giving you anything. This is more susceptible to broader associations. It can be used by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. It can be expressive if you want to. But so in terms of the way form and material is used, it's more open-ended and therefore much more influential. When you compare the two, the early analytic and the synthetic, you can really see the difference. One is clearly breaking apart and fracturing. The other is bringing together and coming together. Late, synthetic cubism continues to have influence for a lot of different artists. This is a late work, 21. This is not synthetic cubism. It doesn't really have a particular label to put on it. It's a very well-known work by him, The Three Musicians, but clearly it comes out of synthetic cubism. It's a layering and building, but now it has a story that's being told. It has associations that are there. And I thought I'd put some images in. Sorry. I was meaning to put in some images to compare it to. These are figures from the Commedia dell'arte. You've got Puccinello and Harlequin, and I don't know who that guy on the right is, but these are sort of classic figures from comedy that in Europe it would have been well known by anybody. So there are sort of associations there. I think sculpture, however, is the most interesting thing that came out of Cubism, because everything changes. And Picasso, I think it's Picasso's most important contribution as well, is in his sculpture more than in his paintings. This is an early piece. It's not really Cubism yet. It's traditional in many, many ways. It's a traditional medium, bronze. I mean, bronze sculpture, goes back to, antiquity. One of the most traditional mediums used in sculpture, bronze casting. In forms, it's traditional in that it's still using mass. It's about shaping this, it may be a distorted surface, but there's more traditional in this piece than there is new in this piece, as we'll see very shortly. Yes, it's more angular, but other than that, it's quite traditional. It's using a mass. It's a solid piece, and it's displacing space. I mean, that's what sculpture does, right? I heard someone once define sculpture as that thing you back into when you're trying to get back up to look at a painting. which is true, but a little insulting. But sculpture is inherently different from painting. Inherently. Painting, drawing, printmaking, any two-dimensional art form exists in a totally different realm and a totally different reality. It's two-dimensional, and two dimensions don't really exist. They're human constructs, and they're never part of our world. That's why people use them to create illusions. They're something we can't really understand and interact with two dimensions. I want to bring in my copy next week of Flatland because I keep talking about it, and I'm going to show you my copy because I've just been rereading it again, a little book called Flatland about these beings that live in a two-dimensional world and what it really means to be in a two-dimensional world. Two dimensions don't exist. We are three-dimensional beings. We live in a three-dimensional world. We cannot conceive of a two-dimensional reality any more than we can conceive of four-dimensional, eight-dimensional, or, according to string theory, up to 11 now dimensions. We can't conceive of that. So all two-dimensional art is a foreign thing to us. We have to somehow decide how to approximate or work with two dimensions that aren't real. Three dimensions, on the other hand, are very much of our world. We have a totally different relationship to sculpture. It is real in our world. It has its own reality. It's a real three-dimensional thing. And as such, it displaces space. If it's sitting here, then it's taking up whatever space would have been there. So that's traditional. Now let's look at what happens with Cubist sculpture. First of all, it's a guitar. How many sculptures of guitars have there been in the history of art? Not counting a sculpture of a man holding a guitar, but a sculpture of a guitar, zero. 99.9% of all sculpture ever made before the 20th century was of one thing, human form. Sculpture is a person, sitting, standing, shooting a gun, whatever. Maybe they're a god, maybe they're a biblical figure, but look at all sculpture. It's people. And that's because of the function of sculpture has always been different from the function of painting, for example. Sculpture is traditionally monument. It's a monument by definition. They're monuments to someone. They're on somebody's tomb, they're commemorating a battle, but they're a monument. It's a totally different role from what painting has ever played. And so they're centered on the human form. So what happens now when you take sculpture out of that role of monument? Sculpture can be anything, just like a painting can be anything. Anything that you could paint, you could make a three-dimensional piece about. That's a totally new way of thinking about sculpture. And that's what begins to a great extent with Picasso. And that's because he's not a sculptor. He wasn't trained. Anyone at this point trained as a sculptor is still making the human form because that's what they were trained to make. But when a painter who knows nothing about sculpture makes something, he does not feel any obligation to be limited to anything. And so when you bring someone out of their normal field and put them in another field, they're going to think differently than all the other people who have trained in that field. Materials. This is most definitely not a traditional material. One of the things we're going to see in three-dimensional art is this embracing of all these new industrial materials. This is the modern world. Yeah, it's metal, but it's not bronze. Sheet metal. We're going to see plastics. All sorts of new industrial materials. Before this, sculpture was, well, in the West, it was mostly marble or bronze. Non-Western cultures, you would see wood. Not that much wood, some wood in the West, but not much wood, because it's not permanent. It's not, immortal like bronze and marble. Sheet metal, also forms planes shaping space. The great metaphor of sculpture, there's as much open space in this piece as there is solid material. In fact, there's more open space because these are just thin planes. It's closer to painting than anything else, which was also about planes. This is literally as if an analytic cubist painting had just come off the canvas and you would have these planes identifying the forms. It's very much the same thing. Open space, rejection of mass. And it's not just Picasso and it's not just Cubism. That's going to be true of modern sculpture. It's going to be mostly open space. It's going to be things that shape that space. So they're changing the metaphor. What art form was primarily defined as planes shaping space? You're sitting in one right now. Architecture. Architecture, by definition, is planes shaping space. That's what sculpture is going to attempt to tap into, is that constructive sensibility. And we're going to talk about constructivism as a major movement between the wars, and it's going to affect painting, it's going to affect sculpture, it's going to affect everything. So we'll see that when we get there. Now, this is the most interesting of them all, the sort of synthetic phase. Again, this is an assemblage of found objects. An assemblage is basically a three-dimensional version of a collage. You know, if it's two-dimensional, we call it a collage. If it's three-dimensional objects being brought together, we call it an assemblage. So this is an assemblage of found objects. And this is a case where found objects bring their meaning with them because you begin to recognize these materials. First of all, it's wood, pieces of wood, but these are not just, you didn't go down to the lumber store or whatever, wherever you buy wood. You can go to Home Depot and buy some little pieces of wood. These clearly have had a life of their own. They've been something. You're seeing tooled wood. Does this come from like a hand railing or a table leg or something? I don't know what it's from, but it's from something. You're getting weathered forms here, violin and bottle on the table. Okay, I can see something that references a violin, something that references a table. This is like bottle-like. I think this is supposed to be the bottle that's sort of opening out. Whatever they are, they're bringing those things with them. I cannot look at this and not, on some level, wonder what this is from, or imagine an object that this would have been, or something that this painted thing would have been. There's scroll work down here. What does that come from? It's sort of like the detritus of someone else's life is now being brought into this work of art. It's not like really powerful here. There are going to be later works of art where it's much more powerful, where you can see where, you know, this came from something else. Like, wow, what happened there? I mean, we aren't going to look at it here, but there's a contemporary guy who works with crushed bits of automobile. And it's like, whoa, that came from a wreck and something bad happened, and what happened there? I mean, he's using it differently, but you know what that is. Yeah.
How is that sitting?
This sits, honestly, I'm not sure. It could either sit flat on a table. Truthfully, more likely it hangs on a wall. Yes.
I see when you first put that up,
Mm-hmm.
my brain does not connect the title to the image I'm seeing. Okay, I'm seeing a bunch of geometry,
Yeah.
and maybe it's a lag. I'm seeing more what you were talking about, planes and architecture.
Right.
Okay.
Well, it is that.
So would two people bring their background or what their subconscious is and say, well, wait a minute.
Yes.
If I struggle, maybe I can see a violin there and a bottle, but
You don't have to struggle. It's okay. But you're right. As with any art ever made, each person brings their own experiences to that work. That is always true of every work of art. In this case, this is Picasso. So there's going to be an edge to that title. And I think the fact that it is hard to see those things is a reason why he's giving you that title. I think there's a bit of humor in there, like, haha, find the violin and bottle. But at the same time, I do see the references he's making. I see clearly there are strings here. That's the reference to the violin. To me, I do see this as a bottle. This is very playfully like the neck of the bottle, the top neck of the bottle. I really think that's it. And the fact that it's a different color, it's like a blue bottle. I mean, I think that's what he's referencing, but it's not necessarily that it's not a picture of a bottle on a table. We know if he wanted that, he could have painted us a picture, or he could have done that.
So the title sort of seems to make you struggle to find what's in the picture. It gives you something to struggle for.
It depends on the artist how much is meant to be a struggle. I think with Picasso, I think it is meant to be a bit of a little play on word and image. Yes. Other artists, not everybody does that. I mean, with other artists, they're more serious about it. It's totally individual. But in this case, I truly believe there's a bit of whimsy there because that's just who he is. I'm only like 5 pages behind on my notes. Clearly, I don't pay any attention to them. Whoops, here I am. Yeah, clearly, I don't pay any attention to them at all. I want to look briefly at some offshoots of Cubism. And there are a number of groups. If you picked up a book and read a book on Cubism, you're going to find people talking about it differently than the way I talk about it. Art historians all form their own interpretations. You should know this. No two art historians are going to agree on anything. It's why we have big conferences and yell at each other. It's because we don't always agree. There are. I usually try and explain to people, why I'm interpreting it this way, so then you don't have to agree with me, so you understand where it's coming from. There are always different ways to define a movement. There are generally, you can either take a movement and define it very, very broadly so that anybody who does anything like it at all, you can call them that. And you're going to find people referring to lots and lots of different things as Cubism. On the other extreme, you can have a really narrow definition where you have like a really clear, pure definition, but only 2 or 3 people meet that. And then all these others are like influenced by it or on the fringes of it or whatever. I tend to go for the very narrow definition because I think it's really confusing when you have a really broad definition, you have no definition at all. If you're trying to include all these things in a group, then you lose any real meaning of what that is. I prefer clarity. I prefer really clear definition, but you have to be willing to leave people undefined. You don't really have to pigeonhole every artist. You don't have to pigeonhole every work of art. So I usually don't label, not everything is labeled. In fact, most art is a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And you're oversimplifying when you limit it to one label. So I call all of these offshoots of Cubism or inspired by Cubism or influenced by Cubism, but none of them are following the plan of a Picasso and a Braque. To me, they're the two pure Cubists, and maybe one other on the side for a little while. But all these other people, without a doubt, are influenced by it. And there were many, many of them. At the time, they were all called Cubists. Also, don't be confused by the terms people used then as opposed to now, because they mean different things by their terms, and it gets very confusing. Okay, I just want to look at 3 different movements. A lot of these groups were centered around this one art gallery in Paris, not Picasso and Braque's gallery. They weren't represented by Rosenberg, but Léonce Rosenberg had a gallery that showed a lot of different artists. Art galleries in Paris at this time and in New York later and in large cities, these were kind of meeting places. They weren't just places you walked in to look at a show. This is where artists hung out. These were places that artists met one another. They often, had activities they planned. I mean, these were like, little community centers for artists. In this case, Rosenberg had a little publishing company that he ran. They published little pamphlets and books that the artists wrote. These were important centers. And this gallery, La Faute Moderne, is the modern spirit or modern effort. The group themselves, all of them together, were called L'Esprit Nouveau, or the New Spirit. They had a magazine called L'Esprit Nouveau that they published every month, where they would write. Artists are writing more. This is the period of manifestos. This is the period where everybody's writing pamphlets and articles and about what they're doing, because they kind of had to. A lot of this wasn't understandable. People didn't understand what people were doing, so they wrote a lot, and Rosenberg published them. Three groups I want to look at briefly: the so-called purists. All three of these groups believed that there were failings in Cubism, that Cubism failed in one way or another. And three of them believed different things, but they all believed that, and their own work was an attempt to sort of rectify some of those problems. The purists first, two artists, and then Orphism, which is really just referred to more or less two people, Robert and Sonia Delaunay, and a couple of other people on the fringes. And then the Section d'Or group, which means the golden section. Talk about that. And also, they were also called the Puteaux group, which is an area, a district in Paris, Puteaux, where they used to meet. So they were sometimes called that. That's really what I usually call them by. And there were quite a few artists moved in and out of that group. But let's look at the purists first. Aux Enfants and Généreux. Généreux, we're going to talk a lot more about later, because that's his real name, but he's better known in the art world as Le Corbusier, which is a nickname. And under the name Le Corbusier, he is probably the foremost architect of the 20th century in Europe. Anyway, he's sort of the European equivalent to Frank Lloyd Wright, in the sense that he's our greatest architect, and we'll look at both of them later. A lot of people don't even know he was a painter. I mean, I think most people just know him as Corbusier and don't even know his real name. But Généreux was a painter briefly, and part of this group. And the purists, or as they called themselves, published. I have a quote here from one of their writings. They wrote a little text called Après le Cubisme, or in other words, after Cubism. And really what it was kind of an indictment of Cubism. Here's what they did wrong, and here's how, we're going to do it right. They said deformation is okay. In other words, it's okay to abstract form as part of a search for that which is universal and invariant. Now, that universal and unchanging, invariant, that's classical language. That's the language of a classicist. And I'll explain what that means more in a minute. But classicism, which goes through the whole history of art, we can go all the way back to ancient Greece and find this origin of this classical idea. And anytime we refer to someone as classicist, there's certain things they have in common. And one of those things is they're searching for something timeless. They're searching for a universal, timeless statement. And that's most definitely not what the Cubists were doing at all. Quite the opposite, in fact, of what they were doing. And that's what they thought was wrong. As two Frenchmen, it's not surprising that they would embrace this classical approach. French have always seen true French tradition as a classical tradition. And, if you're with us or were with us for the Western art tradition, we look at, a long history of art that comes up very early and runs through it. Classical art is French art. They see themselves as classicists. And so they want something more fixed, something more unchanging. I mean, just the opposite of Cubism, really. There's nothing really Cubist here, other than the way the forms are distorted. You get the simplification and the idea of planes, that's there. When I talk about classical, here's a good example. We could go back to the 17th century, which I have right here. On the left, we have a painting by Peter Paul Rubens, who's not French, and then a Poussin on the right, who is French. The one on the left is not classical at all, and the one on the right is. They're both images of the Holy Family. The one on the left, there's a lot of movement, energy and change. It's dynamic. Things are moving in and out of space. You get a range of sort of fluid forms moving around one another. The one on the right is a frozen sculpture. It's like a sculpture. It's perfectly balanced in this wonderful triangle. Nobody's moving. The edges are sharp and clear. The space is sharp and clear. You can see what's behind what. That's a classical approach. That's a French approach. And that's exactly what we see happening in a painting like this. Sharp edges, clarity of space. Analytic cubism, even synthetic, to a lesser extent, was very unclear where things were in space. You couldn't tell what was in front of what. This is absolute clarity. That's what they mean when they say purism. They mean classical sense of space. And this is the genre. It's also very architectonic. I could see the architect in him. I could see where an architect would be drawn to this kind of art. The shapes are sort of architectural hard edge, but it's still modern. It's reduction, it's simplification, but now in clarity. The second group is a couple who actually Sonia Delaunay today is far better known than Robert. So at the time, through much of the 20th century, Robert Delaunay was very known since, the 70s and the women's movement and sort of the examination and understanding of all of these sort of lost women. Sonia Delaunay has become more important, and her designs are really big right now. I'm going to show you some of her designs. They worked together. She was actually a fairly successful artist before they even met. We're going to see a number of different sort of couples in art through this class. There were a number of cases in the 20th century like that, where you mostly know him, but you don't know much about her. They called their movement Orphism. It was also known as simultaneity. Both of those terms are often used. It was called Orphic Cubism is one of the things it was called. And it's about the sort of dynamic energies. And both of these artists are creating non-objective art, not what the Cubists were doing, where they were just abstracting these daily objects and recognizable forms. They go fully non-objective, and that's what they felt was wrong with Cubism. They felt that Cubism went up to a certain point and then it stopped. It was like right on the point of making that leap to being non-objective, and it didn't go there. So that's where they go, as we'll see. Now, these are both Robert Delaunay. Windows, the whole series, the Windows series is quite well known, excuse me, and large. Windows appear in art. There's some interesting 19th century paintings that deal with using windows. Windows can be used metaphorically in a lot of ways. Windows onto things, windows onto the world, an interior space versus an exterior space. So there are interesting ways to use the idea of window. Even the traditional idea of like a painting as a window onto the world. But these are more about windows onto the city. The simultaneously, or simultaneity, as they call it, the movement, is a reference to, again, the modern world where everything's moving quickly and things are all happening at the same time. And this is non-objective art, so this is not distortion of anything recognizable. You're not supposed to recognize. It's communicating through its relationship of forms and colors, but it is about the energy of the city. It's about the modern city. In the 19th century, so much of what we saw was anti-industrialism, was about, the negative about the city. 20th century is going to embrace the modern world in a way the 19th century didn't. It's going to embrace industrialism in a positive way, especially after World War I. It'll be embraced quite positively. The modern city, the energies of the city, the lights, the sound, so many things are changing in the early part of the 20th century. You've got, everybody's looking at the world differently in the early 20th century. You've got Einstein telling people that reality isn't what you thought it was. You've got Freud is telling people that everything you thought about why you behave this way is wrong. Every single discipline out there, whether it's anthropology, you've got Claude Levi-Strauss, in any discipline you can think of, there's somebody out there radically restructuring how you think about it. And it's all happening at the beginning of the 20th century. And so if art didn't respond to that, I would be shocked. So you've got to sort of filter in all those ideas of newness and change and let's think differently. All that's filtering in. It's all in the air. It's so hard for us to, in 2022, to know what it felt like in 1910 or 12 or 15. We don't feel that energy in the air. In fact, we don't know what's really interesting is all of those incredible things that are happening in our world that are feeding into what we do that we don't know and don't think about. 100 years from now, somebody's going to look back and see it. And then they'll write about our age. We can't know it. You can't ever know the world you're living because you're living it. You're in the middle of it. You need somebody with hindsight who can come back and say, wow, in 2022, they were really influenced by this and that and things that we just totally take for granted as, of course, it's ordinary. You don't think about it. So we're doing that now to them 100 years ago. And all of those changes are happening. And you didn't have to. It's like, I've had somebody say like, yeah, but they didn't read Einstein. You didn't have to read Einstein. Everybody was talking about Einstein. You didn't have to read Freud. Everybody was talking about Freud. Things are just in the air and you absorb them. You don't have to go out and study them. It's amazing how much people did know about all these things that were happening. The Tower series, it's a little clearer. Obviously, it's the Eiffel Tower, and he uses that as the symbol of the modern. I mean, it's not that old, right? 1893 or two. Anyway, that's when the Eiffel Tower went up. And this is just about the time, the Parisians hated the Eiffel Tower. When it was built, it was meant to be temporary. And the only way they got the permission to put it in, it was part of a World's Fair in Paris, was that, it was temporary. So yeah, okay, you can put it up, but it's 20 years, it's coming down. And we're just about right there, we're right at that point. And so the Eiffel Tower had other meaning then than it does now. I mean, it was probably still a bit controversial in 1912, but they were right at the point where they were starting to embrace it as the symbol of the modern. And when we look at the constructivist movement later that's happening in the 20s, because he was still working on some of these up until the 20s, it becomes the symbol of the constructive and building a new world. And we'll talk all about that later. So this is obviously not non-objective. Sonia's work was, Sonia Delaunay was from the Ukraine. Sonia Turk was her name. And when she arrived in Paris, she was working, as I said, well-known artist before she married Robert Delaunay. This is one of her paintings, Electric Prism. I just wanted to show you this one because you get a sense of the scale of it. Paintings like this, so that's the great big one there. That's the city. I mean, that is the energy of the city. That is the sounds. You can almost hear the sounds, the lights, the street lights, the automobiles, horns, the lights flashing, traffic lights, all of that is happening here. That's the energy of the city, absolutely. But you can also see it's built on pattern and these beautiful relationships of forms, these edges of forms. And she was very much a fabric designer, a costume designer, and she was one of the best. Now, everyone wore, those are sort of her fabrics, these incredible fabrics that come out of Orphism. Now, this is a painting, but clearly it's three women, but it's the designs of the clothes that they're wearing and the fabrics that they're wearing that are are her designs. And she even was commissioned by Citroën. These are Citroëns to design a car, like one-of-a-kind cars. And these are Sonia Delaunay cars, the old pictures, and the woman is wearing one of her fabric designs. And then this is, I don't know much about this, but this is a modern sort of take on a play on it, on her design. And I know this is one of her designs. She lived much longer. She lived
41.
79, yeah, to 1979. Yeah, he died much earlier, but she was still a major figure until quite recently. Here's some of her designs. I mean, she is the image of the 1920s. When you think of the 20s, it's Sonia Delaunay who designed the 1920s. And I love this. This is Gloria Swanson's coat. She made a special coat just for Gloria Swanson, and that's it. I mean, when you look at the films, the old films, you see her patterns and fabrics everywhere. And she's very, very important today. The Golden Section group, or the Puteaux group, they're called the Golden Section not because they followed the Golden Section. The Golden Section, of course, goes back to ancient Greece, and it's a specific mathematical ratio that were used by the Greeks. It was believed to be the ratio of beauty, or the proportions of beauty, and if you just followed this ratio, things would be beautiful. So there's a lot of Greek sculpture and architecture based on it. They're not literally following that ratio, but at least a few people early on were playing with this idea of fixed ratio, and the name was used and it just stuck. But the artists we're going to look at did not follow those ratios. So that's why I think of it as the Puteaux group. It's the group that met in Puteaux. It's an easier and more accurate way of defining them, but you see both used. Fernand Léger still has a special place in my heart. I did my master's thesis on Fernand Léger, and particularly on one or two groups of his paintings that we'll take a look at. But that was a very long time ago, and I didn't stick with him after that, really. This is an early Léger, and he did this quite early, 1909. I mean, this is before analytic cubism. This is sort of influenced by sort of those very early experiments. It's his own experiment. So he's really very leading edge. It was 1908 that the word cubism was attached to Picasso and Braque. And when he showed this in 1909, of course, the critic referred to it as tubism, which you can see why with some of these figures. But it's this sort of hodgepodge of beings. I think Léger, more than anyone, was obsessed with the modern city and industrialism, and he saw them as like really beautiful and really important to him. I put a quote here. I often put little quotes on here by people so you can see sort of what they're thinking. There's a quote here. He strongly felt there was no hierarchy of beauty, like a machine. This is not just him, but a lot of people think this way in the 20s and 30s. Anything can be beautiful, but beauty is often linked to function. So if you have a machine that's really functional and does exactly what it was designed to do, then it's beautiful. I mean, that's what beauty is, or one way to talk about it. He says here, I will always remember that one year showing at the Salon d'Automne. I had the advantage of being next to the aviation show, which was about to open. Through the partition, I listened to the hammers and the mechanics' songs. I jumped over the barrier, and never, in spite of my familiarity with these spectacles, had I been so impressed. Never had such a stark contrast assailed my eyes. I left vast spaces, dismal and gray, pretentious in their frames. In other words, the art side where he had been, he left that behind, for beautiful metallic objects, hard, permanent, and useful, in pure local colors. Infinite varieties of steel surfaces at play next to vermilions and blues. The power of geometric forms dominated it all. And this was in a it's a long essay called The Machine Aesthetic. And the machine aesthetic is something we're going to be talking about, really dominating at least half of what was made in the 20s and the 30s. This machine is the model for everything. And Leger is really the first artist to do this. He's doing it before World War I even, sort of linking man and machine. And there's an element of that in these forms. There's this machine-like metallic quality. The Contrast of Forms is a series that he worked on. I think he says, no, he doesn't really talk about it here, but he does believe that beauty comes from contrast. Now, this is not objective. He's one of those 5 different people I mentioned last time who sort of simultaneously begin making non-objective art. One of them is Leger, although he doesn't stay with it for very long, but he is experimenting with it during this period. He gave some lectures in 1913 and 14 in Paris where he talked about the independence of color from form, and the greatest beauty comes from contrast. The greater the contrast, and sometimes the greater the dissonance of contrast, that's the greatest beauty, according to him. So you can see the sort of pure colors, these primary colors, and how they're displaced. Again, experimental. I can see how people would see this in the context of Cubism. It's really quite different from what the Cubists were doing, but it's not objective. It's no mass, it's sort of more of a cross between Fauvism and Cubism. There's more Fauvism here than Cubism, but nonetheless, and this is what Kandinsky, we looked at Kandinsky last time. This is what they're both doing in 1913. They're coming from different places, but this is where non-objective art arose. From different points of view. Kandinsky is coming more from the symbolist point of view. He's interested in feeling. Kandinsky's all about feelings. He's all about, we talked about the music and the symphony and the emotions. That's the symbolist context. That's where Kandinsky was coming from. Leger is not so much coming from emotion. He's French. He's not going to come from emotion. He's coming from the intellectual. That's the French view. And so his is coming from somewhere else, but they're non-objective. This was painted during the war. He was a soldier in the war. And so I'm not quite sure where he was when he painted this, but it is soldiers, French soldiers playing a card game. But he's turned them into kind of robots. They're kind of machines. They're fighting machines in a way. But this is the series this is his best work that I worked on. He had 2 series. There's a piece called the Disc series and the City series. And the 2 of them, this is from the City series. And the discs are more like the spiraling disc, like Sonia Delaunay was doing. And they come together in one painting called The Discs in the City. And it really, that's where you see these spiraling forms like flashing lights and things. When they come together with something like this, which is more clearly the city, then it all sort of makes sense. But this is the modern city. This is one of the earliest expressions, positive expressions of the modern city, the essence of the machine aesthetic. And this is a very, is this non-objective? Is this abstraction? I don't know. Those are labels. And I'm not real big on labels. I don't always care what you call something as long as you know what it is. It's this glimpse of the city as you're moving through it and you see it quickly, and there are billboards and signs over here and lights over here, and it's an impression of the modern city, but in a positive way. It's not that 19th century dark view of industrialism and modernity. It's that 20th century optimistic view. And that's it's 1919, so it's after the war. It's just the beginning of the roaring 20s. It's the beginning of that optimism of the 20s. And we can't really overestimate the optimism of the 1920s. It's out of control, which of course is doomed. Yes.
We watch the Brit box, and a lot of those murder mysteries are set in the 20s.
I do too.
and 70s.
Yeah.
And that's what jumped out at me, at all those bright colors in the architecture and the furniture and the,
Well,
Yep.
did they call it art deco? I don't know what they call it.
Well, deco is a little later, but
Okay.
it's a similar, that's where they're
kind of
getting the
started
image.
that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, film designers, stage designers, they look at art. It's really where they get a lot of their designs. They will look at art and because I see it all the time because I recognize where they got it. You know, I'll see a shape or a form, says, I know where they got that. They got that out of this painting. So yeah, the people that design those things are looking at art, and it becomes the visual, because that's what it is. It's the visual voice of a moment in time. And you want to know, get the feel for it, then you use these kinds of forms. But yeah, that's very much what it is. And then this is 21. This is actually early for the kind of conservativeness we see here. One of the things we're going to see for some painters, there is a sort of period where everybody becomes more conservative and classical, and even Picasso does. And this is very classical, not only in the clarity and the sharp edges, but even the subject matter. Just called Three Women on these beautiful patterns, but it's a tapping into like one of the most traditional images in art, which is the Three Graces. Whenever you see three women, you immediately think of the Three Graces. It's tapping into that classical tradition. It's one more, a classical element to it. So this is where sort of the machine aesthetic is tapping into the classical. The machine aesthetic is classical. Machine aesthetic is going to be about clean lines, sharp edges, clarity of space, and that is also classical. So you can see how their machines can be influencing art and justified fairly easily.
Is Cubism over? Is this something-
Cubism's over. Cubism, I would say, maybe I would push it up to 14, beginning of World War I.
So.
And then
As
that's
soon as it got totally non-representative, it kind of died.
non-representational art begins about 1913, and it will continue in some ways. It will definitely continue into the interwar period, but it will be taken in a different direction. It'll become more constructive. It's gonna be caught up in a constructive sensibility. It's gonna become geometric, as opposed to the more expressive that you see before the war. So non-objective will continue, but it will absolutely become more constructive and geometric, both in Russia and in the West.
What's the period?
It doesn't have a label. Most art does not have a label or a tag you can put on it. If I were to describe what this is, I would say it's influenced by Cubism, it's influenced by this, it's got a classical, it's a matter of seeing the bits and pieces, because very little art fits a pure pigeonholed category. Most art is a bit of this and a bit of that, and I can see they knew about this and that. So that's all I really care about. It drove the students crazy, because students want you to give them a label. They want to have a pigeonhole to put something in. They want to have a word they can memorize that will answer everything. And getting them to stop doing that is really hard, because that's what they want.
But it was also a Spaniard.
Who?
The Spaniard who was a Cubist.
Cubist? You mean the surrealist, Dali, or do you mean Paul Klee? Do you mean Paul Klee? Because he's French.
I guess I'll have to go look.
Miro, there aren't that many Spaniards working, doing modern. There's Miro, of course, Dali with the surrealists, but not that many Spaniards. So I'm not sure who you mean.
Yeah, when I look at that one on the right,
Mhm.
on the left, sorry, I think of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Okay, that is a very good reason for that, because Wright, particularly his windows, because he designed art glass for his windows that could be the background of this. You are seeing that early style that will lead into angular deco design. And absolutely, you're right. in front. I see, you're right. There is a lot in there, and we'll point it out when we look at some Frank Lloyd Wright, and you'll see those designs and decorations, particularly his glass. But you'll see it in most of his houses have that sort of art glass, and it has that same design. It's a 1920s sensibility. It's very much a 1920s sensibility. He also made a film. Many artists in the early part of the 20th century, including the Surrealists, were filmmakers. They would make short films, and you find it's, go to YouTube. It's, I'm sure Ballet Mécanique is on YouTube. It's 12-minute film. I used to show it in class, but it's interesting, but it's boring at the same time. It's just all these mechanical things like moving in and out. And then he links it with like the human body. You'll have a person doing something and then a machine that echoes those movements. That's why it's called the ballet mécanique. And that's Kiki, by the way. That Kiki was very, very well known in the 20s. She was often typical flapper. She was an artist model, and she actually lived with Man Ray, who used her as a model. And so you see Kiki in a lot of different things. So she's in this film, and it's bizarre. Watch it. Everybody should watch Ballet Mécanique, at least a little bit of it before you get bored. But because it's 12. Yeah, how do you get bored in 12 minutes? Well, it's like so repetitive. It's like I got it, and then here's this thing again. And then there's this old woman walking up a set of stairs, and then she's at the bottom. She's walking up a set of, and then she's walking, and then you watch these things move, and then here's the old woman walking up, and it's like 12 minutes of that is a long time. But it does give a sense of how they were thinking, in terms of this uniting of man and machine, which is what it was really all about. So we're back with our friends at home. Let me open you guys up. Does anybody have any questions and comments?
Where was Toulouse-Lautrec in history?
He's at the turn of the century. Toulouse-Lautrec falls in a he's in a bad spot. He's not really this and he's not really that, which often gets him left out. Lautrec was working at the turn of the century, late in the 90s and then into the beginning. He's a 19th century artist. He's very interesting and I love his work, but he's actually not an innovator. What he's doing is what people were doing 10 and 20 years earlier. He's doing it really well, and I love his work, but he's not giving us anything new. That's why he sometimes falls between the cracks. He was absolutely part of the art scene. Oh, very much so. He was right at the center of it at the turn of the century, in the bars and the brothels, and he was an aristocrat that was basically not abandoned by his family because he had money, but they knew he was never going to step in and do his aristocratic duties, so he had freedom. He had freedom to do what he wanted.
Almost a chronicler of his time. I think of it more of almost like an artist turned newspaper man or historian.
He was a realist.
Point in time.
He was doing what Manet and Degas were doing in the 60s and 70s, but he was doing it at the turn of the century. They were depicting like the bars and the people and, kind of social commentary on what was going on. That's what he was doing. But, in 1900, that's not an innovative idea. It was in 1860 and 1870. So we really look at that because it's important. Now, that doesn't mean he's not making good art. I love his work. I mean, his handling of his materials is really beautiful and sort of juicy and very sensual. But he does tend to fall between the cracks because when we're teaching, we tend to be looking at like innovators, and focusing more on that. In a more advanced class where you slow down and really have the time, then you'll get to have the time to look at him. But it doesn't always happen. And he's not the only one. It's too bad. But there are, hate to tell you, there are several hundred artists we aren't looking at who are working right at this time. So, and what's interesting is, in a class that's taught 100 years from now, they may be looking at totally different people. In fact, they probably will be looking at totally different people because they'll be interested in, it'll depend on who they are. But I do find it interesting that we're reaching the point where we're now all having more of a knowledge of what's going on, and we're seeing more contemporary references. I mean, when you're looking at art from 1850, there's not much we can say about our world right now that, I recognize, that's relevant. But as we get into the 20s and the 30s, like, we're recognizing this deco images and things we're seeing in movies, and it is becoming more recognizable to us and more understandable because we just know more about the 20th century, most people do, than they do about the 19th because we were living in it. Anybody have any other questions or comments? Let me see what we're doing next time. I don't remember. Okay, we're beginning in the interwar period, and we're spending more time on the interwar period. Oh, good, we're going to Russia. That's very special to me. Yeah, such an interesting place. Oh, I could talk for hours about Russia, but yeah, Italy first briefly, and then Russia, and then we're okay to talk
Peggy?
revolution.
Peggy?
You're welcome.